Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on a journey across the vast stretches of the Silk Roads. Those ancient trade routes that wound their way through deserts, mountains, and cities, linking east and west like no other network in history. Picture yourself standing at the bustling market of Samarkand, feeling the heat of the sun and the scent of spices, silks, and incense wafting in the air. Now imagine trekking across these routes, probably with a few extra layers on as the temperature shifts from searing heat to freezing cold, and making deals with traders who might as well have been from another world. And here's a reality check if you were a merchant back in the day. Chances are you'd be part of one of the most challenging and rewarding trade ventures in the world. You probably won't survive this, at least not in one piece, but let's just imagine you're the exception. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, no pressure, right? I'm sure you've got a lot of other things to do, like staring at your phone or procrastinating. But if this type of historical deep dive sounds like your cup of tea, or should I say your cup of ancient silk, you're in the right place. Oh, and hey, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this story reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Silk Roads were more than just one continuous path. They were a collection of trade routes stretching from China all the way to the Mediterranean. Picture caravans of camels carrying everything from exotic spices to luxury fabrics, crossing some of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But the history of the Silk Roads isn't as simple as China sells silk, Europe buys it. Oh no, my friend. It's so much more complex than that. These roads connected civilizations, spread cultures, ideas, and goods, and they did it over hundreds of years long before we had the internet to make things more instant and convenient. Historians still argue about the exact start of the Silk Roads and how these networks were truly mapped. Some say they began with the Han Dynasty around 130 BCE, when China decided it was time to trade silk with the West. Others argue that trade routes existed even earlier, maybe around 500 BCE, evolving organically as merchants found their way across Asia, wherever you place the beginning. These trade routes came to be so important that they formed a lifeline between different cultures and empires, making the Silk Roads one of the most powerful historical phenomena you probably never learned about in school. Now that we've touched on the beginnings of these iconic trade routes, let's shift gears a little. You probably thought the Silk Roads were all about silk, right? I mean, it's in the name, but here's the thing. The Silk Roads weren't just about this delicate, shimmering fabric that became the talk of the ancient world. Oh no. These roads were like the ancient version of Amazon.com, except instead of 2-day shipping, you might wait years for your goods to arrive. The vastness of these routes allowed for a whole host of products to be exchanged. And guess what? They weren't just selling silk. Far from it. These roads were also the conduit for an assortment of goods that would make even your local flea market seem a little underwhelming. Picture it goods like ivory glassware and even precious stones were part of the vast trade. And it's not just about what went eastward from the west. Oh no. The East sent over exotic silks and spices, sure, but also innovations like paper gunpowder and even printing techniques. Can you imagine receiving an early manuscript from China just as the printing press was starting to spread? That, my friend, is an exchange of knowledge that predates modern information sharing by centuries. The fact that we even got here with just the tiniest help from ancient merchants is mind-boggling. Historians still argue over which goods were most important in the Grand Exchange. Was silk truly the prized possession of the ancients? Or was it the spices that flavored the world's cuisine? Or perhaps even the mysteries of perfume making that captured the imagination of ancient royals? Some say it was the spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper that were the true treasures of the East. After all, in a world where refrigeration wasn't a thing, spices did wonders for preserving food and covering up the less than appealing scent of certain less than fresh meals. The idea that these merchants not only brought spices but also life-changing ideas, philosophies, and technologies can't be overstated. Just think about it. The people who traded goods were not simply selling products. They were carrying entire worldviews, religions, and inventions on their backs as they crossed deserts and battled the elements. Talk about multitasking. One moment you're trading a sack of cinnamon, the next moment you're passing along the idea of paper to the West, or teaching someone how to brew tea properly. This wasn't just commerce. It was cultural diffusion at its finest. Now, let's zoom in on the fabric that gave the Silk Roads their name, silk itself. You might be wondering, what's so special about silk anyway? I mean, it's just a fancy cloth, right? Well, yes and no. Silk wasn't just the luxury fabric of choice. It was a symbol of wealth, status, and sophistication. For centuries, China kept the secret of silk making so guarded that it became something of a mystical art. Seriously, if you were a foreigner looking to get your hands on some silk, you had better be prepared for one heck of a journey, and it wasn't going to be easy. Historians still argue over whether the secret of silk was truly kept within China's borders for as long as some claim. Some stories suggest that the Chinese kept it a secret for over 1,000 years, with elaborate punishments for anyone caught trying to smuggle silkworms or the knowledge of silk production out of the empire. Imagine the scene: a covert meeting between a Chinese silk weaver and a Persian merchant. The deal done under the cover of night with the silkworm eggs hidden in a pouch. Not exactly the stuff of modern-day business deals, is it? But that's how valuable silk was. It wasn't just a fabric. It was an asset so valuable that it inspired an entire covert trade network. As you can imagine, once silk began flowing westward, it became one of the most sought-after items along the Silk Roads. And the demand wasn't just for the fabric itself. Oh no, the wealthy didn't just want silk to wear. They wanted it to show off to flaunt their status to the rest of the world. Roman emperors, Persian kings, and even Byzantine rulers loved showing off their finely embroidered silk garments at grand feasts and public ceremonies. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about showing who was in charge, who had access to the finest things in life. But here's the twist: silk wasn't only for the elite. Even though it was often reserved for the highest echelons of society, it trickled down through the ranks, eventually making its way into the wardrobes of the middle classes, and even into the hands of everyday traders. In fact, it was a symbol of aspiration. Think of it as the luxury brand of the ancient world. So, while the richest emperors and kings had entire wardrobes full of silk, the traders themselves probably had a bit of silk tucked away in their bags to show off to potential buyers and suppliers. Historians still debate how silk was viewed across different cultures. Was it considered a divine material, a symbol of immortality, as the Chinese seem to think? Or was it simply a precious commodity highly prized because of its rarity and the labor required to produce it? Maybe it was all of the above. What we do know is that silk wove its way into the very fabric of the Silk Roads themselves, becoming more than just a textile. It became a vehicle for culture, wealth, and power. Now, while silk may have been the star of the show, let's not forget about the vital supporting cast, the spices. You've probably heard about cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. But what you might not realize is how essential these seemingly small items were to the daily lives of people across the ancient world. Imagine this. You've just finished a long journey along the Silk Roads, crossing deserts, navigating mountains. And now you're sitting in a bustling marketplace somewhere in the Middle East, taking in the aroma of fresh spices that would soon travel to far-flung corners of the world. These weren't just flavorings for your food. They were prized commodities considered just as valuable, if not more so, than gold. Spices like pepper were the first luxury item for the Romans to import in large quantities. And why? Well, aside from flavoring food, pepper was believed to have medicinal properties. Historians still argue whether the Romans knew the true health benefits of pepper, like its ability to stimulate digestion or help with blood circulation, or if they simply valued it as a rare commodity. It was traded and sought after across the Mediterranean world, and the Roman elite loved it so much that they had it shipped to them in large quantities. Picture the grand feasts, roasted meats, exotic fruits, and of course dishes laced with pepper, all laid out on golden plates as the aristocracy showed off their wealth and refinement. But spices weren't just used for food. Oh no, they were crucial for preserving food in a time when refrigeration wasn't exactly a thing. Without the ability to preserve food for long journeys, trading goods like dried meats and fruits would have been near impossible. Spices were mixed into these preserved foods to prevent spoilage, and their aroma helped mask the less than pleasant smells of less than fresh fare. You can imagine some poor merchant on a long, dusty trek trying to keep his stock of dried fish fresh with a sprinkling of salt and pepper to make it bearable. Even in the East, spices were part of everyday life, and different regions valued different spices for their unique flavors and uses. Cinnamon, for example, was cherished not just in the West, but also in places like India, where it was used in religious rituals. In fact, cinnamon was so valuable that it was often traded along the same routes as silk, with merchants crossing hundreds of miles to secure this precious spice. These spices, along with others like cloves, cardamom, and ginger, became integral to both cuisine and medicine, slowly blending cultures along the way. Historians still debate whether the value of spices was entirely due to their rarity, or if they were also seen as gifts from the gods. Could it have been their mysterious exotic nature that made them so alluring? Or perhaps, much like honey or silk, spices represented something more spiritual, an embodiment of life vitality and the exotic unknown. What we do know is that without spices, the world of the Silk Roads would have been vastly different, and the very nature of these trade routes would have been altered. But let's not get too caught up in just food and fabrics. The Silk Roads weren't just for trading luxuries. They were also crucial for the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and technologies that shaped the ancient world. Imagine this merchants traveling along these vast routes, not only with sacks of spices or rolls of silk, but also carrying the wisdom of entire cultures. The fact that knowledge could travel this far is one of the most exciting aspects of the Silk Roads. Picture yourself standing in a bustling market in Samarkand, where traders from China, Persia, India, and even the Roman Empire are all discussing everything from astronomy to medicine without a single Google search in sight. They weren't just selling goods. They were sharing knowledge that would influence the course of history. Let's start with one of the most surprising exports: paper. Yes, paper. We tend to think of paper as something that's just there. But back in the day, it was revolutionary. The Chinese were the first to develop paper around 100 BCE, and for centuries they kept it to themselves. It wasn't until the 8th century, when the Chinese paper-making techniques were shared with the Islamic world, that the true value of paper was realized. And of course, as the paper-making knowledge spread westward through the Silk Roads, it eventually made its way to Europe, sparking a huge shift in literacy and education. It's crazy to think that something as simple as a sheet of paper could change the world, but it absolutely did. Historians still argue about whether the transmission of paper making was one of the most important moments in world history. Did it revolutionize knowledge in the same way the printing press did centuries later? Some believe that the spread of papermaking helped set the stage for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. It's a quiet yet profound exchange that took place over hundreds of years. Now, let's turn our attention to another fascinating export: gunpowder. You might not think of it as something that would make a cozy bedtime story, but stick with me. Gunpowder was another Chinese invention that made its way along the Silk Roads, changing the course of history in unexpected ways. Once gunpowder reached the Islamic world and then Europe, it radically transformed warfare, enabling the rise of powerful empires and changing the balance of power globally. Historians still debate whether gunpowder's widespread use was a necessary evil that propelled civilizations forward, or if it introduced a dangerous and volatile element that forever altered the course of human conflict. It's not just about hard science and invention, though. The Silk Roads were also responsible for the spread of spiritual and philosophical ideas. Buddhism, for example, made its way from India to China along these routes where it eventually spread throughout East Asia. Imagine a peaceful Buddhist monk sitting in a caravanserai, talking to a merchant from Persia about meditation techniques, with the faint scent of sandalwood incense floating in the air. That exchange of ideas is just as powerful as the exchange of spices or silk. Similarly, the philosophies of Greece and Rome trickled into the East through these same channels. These weren't just routes for material goods, they were also intellectual highways, connecting people across vast distances and introducing them to new ways of thinking. Historians still argue whether the exchange of ideas along the Silk Roads was as influential as the trade of goods. Could ideas spread faster than physical goods, or did they simply travel alongside them? One thing's for sure, these exchanges were key to the development of not just trade, but the development of entire cultures. Knowledge from the East met the West and vice versa, creating a cross-pollination that gave birth to entire philosophies, religions, and innovations that we continue to build upon today. Now that we have talked about some of the incredible exchanges of knowledge and invention, let's focus on one of the more unusual exports of the Silk Road's glass. You might be thinking, wait, glass? Really? But hear me out. Glass was an incredibly important trade. Good, particularly in the ancient world. Glassware, especially beads and small vessels, was a luxury item highly prized by the Romans, Persians, and others along the Silk Roads. And while you might associate glass with the modern world, it was just as revolutionary back then as paper or gunpowder. The ancient Egyptians were some of the first to experiment with glass, and their techniques spread along the Silk Roads, where it was refined and used for both decorative and functional purposes. Imagine an ancient Persian merchant standing in a bustling market in Baghdad, showing off finely crafted glass beads and vessels, the sunlight glinting off their smooth, shiny surfaces. These glass items were often used in jewelry, but they also had practical applications. Think about the Roman Empire, where glassware was becoming more commonplace in wealthy households. The Romans valued clear glass containers for storing wine perfumes and oils, and these glass items were often considered symbols of status. In fact, the art of glassmaking became so advanced that the Romans even developed techniques to make glass windows a game changer for architecture at the time. Historians still debate whether the spread of glass technology had a more profound effect on culture than other items traded along the Silk Roads. Some argue that glass helped elevate the artistry of many cultures, while others believe that its primary role was more utilitarian. One thing is clear, though, as glass-making techniques spread across Asia and the Middle East, the craft evolved in unique ways, influencing everything from architecture to art to scientific instruments. And speaking of art, it's important to note that the Silk Roads weren't just for the exchange of practical goods and knowledge. They were also a place for the exchange of artistic expression. Let's talk about the art and sculptures that traveled along the routes. Artists and craftsmen from the East influenced those in the West and vice versa, leading to a fascinating fusion of styles and techniques. Picture a scroll artist from China sitting down with an artist from Persia, exchanging ideas on how to portray figures in art, or how to incorporate intricate patterns into a design. These artistic exchanges were happening on an almost daily basis along the Silk Roads, as people from completely different cultures met, shared ideas, and created new works of art. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads were more of a catalyst for cultural exchange or a byproduct of trade. Was the art being exchanged just as valuable as the spices and fabrics? Some argue that art, philosophy, and religion were the real treasures exchanged along these routes, subtly shaping societies in ways that material goods couldn't. Regardless, the art that traveled along these roads shaped everything from royal palaces to everyday objects, leaving a lasting legacy that can still be seen in museum collections around the world today. Now, let's zoom in on one of the more unexpected but significant aspects of Silk Road trade animals. Yes, animals, believe it or not, they were part of this massive network, and they were more than just exotic curiosities for the wealthy. We're talking about real working animals that played a critical role in the success of trade along the Silk Roads. Picture yourself standing beside a caravan, camels laden with goods, the desert wind sweeping through the dusty air. These animals weren't just for show. They were essential to the transportation of goods over the long, difficult stretches of desert and mountainous terrain. Camels, often called the ships of the desert, were perhaps the most important animals involved in Silk Road trade. These incredible creatures could travel vast distances without much water, making them perfectly suited to the harsh conditions of Central Asia's arid stretches. The introduction of camels into the trade routes opened up the possibility of connecting areas that would have otherwise been nearly impossible to reach. You could think of them as the 4x4 vehicles of the ancient world, carrying everything from precious silks to spices without breaking a sweat or, well, not much of one. Historians still debate whether camels were the true heroes of the Silk Roads. Could the trade have happened without them? Some say that the use of camels allowed for the growth of cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, which became thriving centers of culture and commerce, all thanks to these incredible animals. In the absence of camels, the idea of a continuous overland trade route across the vast expanse of Asia might never have been possible. So, next time you see a camel in a picture, Just remember that humble beast might have been the unsung hero of ancient global trade. But it wasn't just camels that contributed to the Silk Roads. Horses, mules, and even elephants made appearances along the routes, each adding their own unique capabilities to the trade system. Horses were often used to carry lighter, quicker loads across shorter distances, particularly in areas where terrain was less harsh. Mules, with their strength and stamina, were used in mountainous regions where their sure-footedness allowed them to carry heavy loads up steep slopes. And elephants. Yes, elephants were used for transporting large quantities of goods, particularly in India, where they were vital for moving spices and other heavy trade items through jungle terrain. These animals didn't just facilitate trade, they became symbols of the empire's power and reach. Imagine the awe of a Roman official seeing elephants marching across the desert, their massive forms towering over the landscape as they carried loads of precious goods. The sight would have been nothing short of spectacular. A reminder of the far-reaching reach of the Silk Roads and the different cultures and technologies that came together through these shared trade networks. Historians still debate the extent to which the trade of animals along the Silk Roads influenced the cultural exchange that took place. Did these animals symbolize the physical strength of the cultures that used them? Or did they serve as cultural exchanges in their own right, moving ideas, technologies, and practices between civilizations? Either way, one thing is certain: without these animals, the Silk Roads wouldn't have been the same. They were the true backbone of the trade, carrying with them the wealth, knowledge, and goods that changed the world. Now that we've talked about the animals that made the Silk Roads possible, let's shift our focus to another key element: the luxury goods that traveled these routes. You might be thinking of the familiar items: silk, spices, precious stones. But let's dig deeper into some of the more unusual commodities that found their way along these ancient highways. The trade routes didn't just exchange tangible goods, they were also responsible for moving culture, religion, and the status symbols of entire civilizations. One particularly fascinating trade good was jade. This precious stone, which had immense cultural significance in places like China, was highly prized across the Silk Roads. The Chinese had been working with jade for over 3,000 years, and it wasn't just used for jewelry or ornaments, it had deep spiritual meaning. In China, jade was believed to have protective properties often associated with immortality and strength. As the jade trade grew along the Silk Roads, it found its way into the hands of Central Asian nomads, Persian rulers, and even the Romans, who valued it as a symbol of wealth and power. Imagine the scene: a caravan making its way across the vast desert, camels carrying not just silks or spices, but precious jade figurines, amulets, and polished stones. To the outside world, jade was a luxury item coveted by the elites of many cultures. It was traded in small pieces, but its value was immeasurable. Not just for its beauty, but for its symbolism. In many cultures, possessing jade meant you were a person of status, someone whose wealth could be measured by the finest things in life. And jade wasn't just about luxury, it was also about power, spirituality, and status. The exchange of jade along the Silk Roads carried these complex meanings, making it more than just a commodity. It became a tool for connecting people with deeper, almost mystical forces. Historians still argue over whether jade was considered the most valuable item on the Silk Roads. Was it more important than silk? Could it compete with the value of precious metals like gold and silver? Some believe jade was so culturally significant that it transcended its physical value, becoming a spiritual and symbolic item. Others contend that while jade was important, it was the trade of spices and silk that truly dominated the exchanges along the routes. Regardless, jade's presence along the Silk Roads contributed to the overall richness of these cultural exchanges, adding another layer of depth to the already complex trade systems. And let's not forget the extraordinary influence of luxury goods on the development of the Silk Roads. The demand for exotic and rare items sparked the creation of thriving cities along the trade routes from Bukhara to Baghdad, Samarkand, to Xi'an. These cities, where traders from different cultures would meet and exchange goods, became melting pots of ideas and influences. They were not just places of commerce, they were places of cultural fusion where fashion, philosophy, and luxury intertwined. Historians often debate the role of these luxury goods in shaping the Silk Roads. Were they a primary driver of trade, or were they more of a secondary consequence of the real focus? The exchange of knowledge, religion, and political power. One thing is clear, though the allure of luxury goods, whether it was jade silk or exotic perfumes, added an undeniable richness to the Silk Roads that captured the imagination of countless generations. They weren't just trading material objects. They were trading symbols of prestige, power, and culture. Now that we've explored the wealth of luxury items that traveled the Silk Roads, let's take a closer look at something that might seem a bit more mundane, but was no less impactful everyday goods. While silk spices and precious stones made the headlines, the Silk Roads weren't just about the opulent treasures. No, they also carried the simple yet indispensable products that people used daily. These everyday items might not have seemed exciting at the time, but without them, the economies and societies along the Silk Roads would have been much less robust. One of these unsung heroes was glass. Glass, yes, glass. It's easy to forget, but glass was an essential part of life, especially for the ancient civilizations that lived along the Silk Roads. The Egyptians, the Romans, the Persians. All of these cultures depended on glass for everything from containers to windows. The first glass items traded along the Silk Roads were primarily beads and small vessels, but as the techniques for glassmaking spread westward, so too did the quality and complexity of the items produced. By the time glass had reached Europe, it wasn't just being used for simple utility. It had become a symbol of status, a luxury good that signified wealth and refinement. In fact, by the time the Romans were importing glass from the East, it had become a critical part of their decorative arts. Think about it. The Romans, with their grand villas, could afford to display intricate glass windows, goblets, and jars in their homes. For the wealthy, owning fine glass was a way to demonstrate not just wealth, but culture and sophistication. Glass was also crucial in other areas of life like medicine and science. Early scientific instruments, such as lenses and magnifying glasses, were made of glass and came to Europe along these very trade routes. These small items, traded in relative obscurity, would later be used in astronomical studies and innovations that transformed Western science. Historians still argue about the precise role of glass in the Silk Road's trade. Was it a luxury, or was it primarily used for more functional purposes? Some believe that glass was just as significant as luxury goods, like jade silk or spices, because of its value in daily life and its widespread use. Others suggest that it was more of a byproduct of other trades, merely something that traveled along the same routes without receiving as much attention. Either way, glass played a huge part in the Silk Roads, both as a commodity and as a symbol of cross-cultural exchange. As glass moved along these routes, it did more than just provide useful items. It also represented a growing connectivity between far-flung civilizations. The exchange of glass techniques, especially between the Romans and the people of the Eastern empires, helped improve both the quality and the production of glass. And let's not forget the visual aspect. Glass was often used in decorative arts like mosaics and windows, and as it traveled, it left behind a legacy of beauty and craftsmanship. The intricate glass pieces that were created and traded along the Silk Roads were more than just functional. They were works of art inspired by the very cultures that produced them. Historians still debate how glass compares to other items traded along the Silk Roads. Was it an item that simply followed the flow of more valuable commodities, or did it hold its own in terms of significance? Some argue that glass played an understated yet vital role, providing both practical uses and artistic value to those lucky enough to possess it. Regardless, glass is a reminder that not every valuable commodity has to be a luxury or rare. Sometimes the most important trade items are the ones that are universally useful. As we continue this journey along the Silk Roads, let's now take a moment to explore a topic that might surprise you, tea. That's right, tea. You probably didn't think it was one of the legendary goods to travel along these vast trade routes. But the history of tea is just as intertwined with the Silk Roads as silk itself. Tea, though now a global staple, had humble beginnings in China, where it was considered both a medicinal herb and a ritualistic drink long before it made its way to the West. But just how did tea, a drink that's so commonly associated with modern-day comfort, become a luxury item on the Silk Roads? The story begins in China, where tea was initially consumed for its health benefits. Tea leaves were steeped in hot water to produce a refreshing beverage that was believed to have a variety of medicinal properties. In fact, Chinese physicians prescribed tea for everything from improving digestion to boosting energy levels. But tea wasn't just a drink. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. It was consumed in various forms such as powdered tea, and even used in religious ceremonies. You could imagine being an ancient Chinese scholar, sitting in a bamboo-framed room preparing a cup of tea to settle your mind before writing a poem. The gentle ritual of tea drinking carried with it a sense of peace and reflection, which was not just a physical experience, but a spiritual one as well. But tea didn't remain confined to China for long. As the Silk Roads expanded, the trade routes allowed tea to make its way into Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. By the time it reached India, tea became a valuable commodity, often mixed with milk and spices to create the rich, flavorful chai we know today. The demand for tea increased particularly in Persia and the Islamic world, where it was used both for its medicinal properties and as a luxury drink at lavish gatherings. Imagine walking into a bustling Persian bazaar, where traders are hawking all sorts of exotic goods, and in the middle of it, all tea is being served to merchants and travelers. It was a drink that symbolized refinement and culture, and it quickly became associated with social gatherings and diplomacy. Tea's journey to the West is another chapter in this fascinating story. It wasn't until the 16th century, when the Dutch East India Company began importing tea to Europe, that tea truly became a fashionable luxury item in the West. By then, tea had already traveled through a series of different cultures, each adding their own twist to it. The drink was consumed by royalty and aristocrats who valued it not only for its flavor, but for its status as a rare commodity. The first English tea houses opened in London in the 17th century, and soon tea drinking became a social ritual, particularly among the upper classes. Historians still debate whether the spread of tea was purely a matter of trade, or whether it was also a symbol of cultural exchange. Was it the allure of a rare and luxurious drink, or did tea serve as a vehicle for social and cultural interactions? Some historians suggest that the adoption of tea in Europe, for instance, was as much about socializing and forming diplomatic ties as it was about enjoying the drink itself. Tea drinking became an art form tied to the growing culture of refined leisure in Europe. You could imagine early English tea drinkers sitting in their grand estates, chatting about politics or art, all while sipping from delicate porcelain cups. Tea's cultural significance cannot be overstated. It became more than just a beverage. It was a marker of status, an excuse for social gatherings, and even a way to engage in political discourse. Whether it was shared between traders on the Silk Roads or sipped by aristocrats in European salons, tea has become one of the most enduring legacies of the Silk Roads. What started as a medicinal herb has over centuries evolved into a global commodity, one that carries with it a long history of cultural exchange and interaction. Historians still argue about the precise moment when tea became a true luxury item. Was it in China, where it was first cultivated and consumed, or was it when it reached the aristocratic courts of Europe? Some say it was when tea was first introduced to the royal courts of England, while others argue that tea's true value was seen when it became the centerpiece of social gatherings in Central Asia. Regardless of where you place the origin of its luxury status, tea continues to be a symbol of cultural exchange, a drink that traveled across continents bringing people together over shared cups, quiet conversations, and a sip of history. We've just seen how tea traveled from the east to the west, but let's not forget that the Silk Roads weren't all about the big name items, like tea silk or spices. There were countless other goods and ideas that made their way along these ancient routes, including one particularly fascinating aspect: medicine. You might be wondering, how did medicine travel along the Silk Roads? Well, the answer is both simple and complex. Just as spices and fabrics carried cultural significance, so too did the medicinal practices and herbs of the East. Ancient Chinese medicine, with its emphasis on herbal remedies, acupuncture, and holistic treatments, had a profound influence on the Silk Roads. Along these trade routes, the medicinal knowledge of China made its way to the Islamic world, and then into Europe, where it would eventually be integrated into Western medicine. The exchange wasn't just about trading physical remedies, but also about trading knowledge about how to treat ailments using the plants and herbs native to the different regions. For example, ginseng, a plant prized for its purported energy-boosting properties, was traded along the Silk Roads and became one of the most sought-after medicinal products. It was believed to help with everything from fatigue to improving blood circulation, and its benefits were highly regarded by both the East and West. Imagine yourself walking through a market in Baghdad or Samarkand, the aroma of medicinal herbs and spices filling the air as a Persian merchant offers you dried ginseng root, promising that it will cure whatever ails you. These merchants didn't just trade goods, they were also sharing ancient wisdom passed down through generations. As these remedies moved along the Silk Roads, they blended with the knowledge of different cultures, creating new forms of treatment that might have never existed otherwise. For example, herbal practices from China mixed with Persian medicine, influencing the medical traditions of the Middle East, and eventually trickling down to Europe, where figures like Hippocrates and Galen built on these ideas. Historians still debate how much of the ancient medical knowledge that traveled along the Silk Roads was actually effective by today's standards. Some argue that much of it was based on superstition or misunderstanding, while others believe that ancient remedies like those using honey or herbal teas held genuine healing power. One thing's for sure, the Silk Roads were vital to the spread of ideas about health and wellness, and they provided a bridge for various cultures to share their medical wisdom, creating a richer, more interconnected world of healing practices. Let's also take a moment to appreciate how the Islamic world, with its scholarly approach to medicine, played a critical role in the exchange of medical knowledge. By the 9th and 10th centuries, scholars in cities like Baghdad were translating and refining Greek medical texts, and they made significant contributions to the development of medical science. These texts, along with knowledge of herbs, surgical techniques, and pharmacology, were passed along the Silk Roads, where they would influence European medical practices centuries later. Islamic physicians like Avicenna wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias that were used as textbooks in both the Islamic world and Europe for hundreds of years. So, next time you think about ancient medicine, consider the incredible cross-cultural collaboration that made it possible. Historians still argue whether medicine on the Silk Roads was more of an exchange of scientific knowledge or a fusion of mysticism and superstition. Did the knowledge passed along these trade routes lay the foundation for modern medicine? Or was it more of a blend of practices that, while useful in their own time, were outdated by modern standards? Either way, we can all agree that the Silk Roads helped to preserve and disseminate medical knowledge that would shape future generations of healers and physicians across the world. As we move forward on this journey, it's time to talk about another fascinating and perhaps unexpected aspect of the Silk Roads, the trade of glass. Yes, glass. While we often associate glass with modern conveniences like Windows bottles and even smartphones in the ancient world, it was just as revolutionary. The technique of glassmaking, especially the craft of making beads and small vessels, traveled along the Silk Roads, crossing the paths of traders, empires, and cultures from the Mediterranean to China. Glass started as a luxury good, created primarily in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, where it was used for decorative items like beads, amulets, and small containers. But the techniques for glass production didn't stay in one place. As the Silk Roads flourished, these techniques spread, and glassmaking slowly became a prized craft that was shared among many civilizations. Picture this: an ancient glassblower in Alexandria, Egypt, carefully shaping molten glass with a metal rod, creating intricate beads that would be traded across the desert and mountains, eventually making their way to the markets of Persia, India, and even as far as China. Roman and Byzantine glassworkers were especially renowned for their craft, and they brought their skills along the trade routes, adding a new dimension to the products available to Silk Road merchants. Roman glassware, intricately designed goblets, containers, and jewelry was highly sought after, symbolizing wealth and culture. These pieces weren't just used for practical purposes. They were also art, and the wealthy elite of the Silk Road's different cultures treasured them. Imagine walking into the palace of a Persian king, where glass vessels glinting in the sunlight were displayed alongside treasures from every corner of the empire. These items were a testament to the world's growing interconnectedness. Historians still argue whether the glass traded along the Silk Roads was a byproduct of luxury trade, or if it played a larger role in the development of daily life. Some believe that glass was vital for everyday use, used for everything from containers for oil and perfume to windows for grand structures. Others suggest that it was the beauty and status associated with these luxurious glass items that made them truly valuable. Either way, glass served as a tangible representation of the cultural exchange occurring along the Silk Roads. The techniques of glass blowing didn't just improve over time. They were enriched by the different influences from the cultures trading along the routes. The influence of glass continued to spread westward, eventually reaching medieval Europe. By the time glass production techniques reached Venice in the 13th century, the Italians had turned glassmaking into an art form, producing some of the finest glassware in the world. Murano glass, still famous today, can trace its roots back to the glass-making techniques that spread along the Silk Roads. So the next time you admire a beautiful glass vase or a fine piece of jewelry, remember that its origins might stretch all the way back to ancient trade routes carried by merchants traveling from east to west, bringing not just goods, but also the knowledge to create art from fire and sand. Historians still debate whether the spread of glass was as important as the exchange of more valuable materials, like silk and spices. Did glass change the course of art and architecture? Was it as crucial to everyday life as we now know it to be? Whatever the answer, it's clear that glass, like so many other commodities, was not just a product. It was a symbol of the deep cultural exchange that made the Silk Roads so transformative for the world. As we continue to explore the immense impact of the Silk Roads, we come to a key but often overlooked aspect of these ancient trade routes: the stories of the individual merchants who traveled along them. It's easy to think of the Silk Roads as a grand network of trade that was facilitated by an impersonal system. But the truth is far more personal and dynamic. The Silk Roads were built on the backs of thousands of merchants, many of whom risked everything to carry goods and ideas across vast stretches of land and desert. These traders weren't just selling goods, they were forging connections, building relationships, and shaping the course of history. Imagine yourself as one of these merchants stepping out from a crowded market in a city like Xi'an, carrying a heavy pack of goods, knowing that you're about to embark on a journey that could take months, if not years. Your cargo might include silk, precious stones, or even something as seemingly mundane as glass beads. But to you, it's worth the risk. These merchants knew that the path they walked was fraught with danger. Bandits, extreme, weather-treacherous terrain, and even political instability threatened them at every turn. Yet they kept moving forward, driven by the promise of wealth and the desire to share their culture with the world. Historians still debate the motivations of these traders. Were they simply seeking profit, or did they feel a sense of duty to connect far-flung cultures? Some believe that the merchants were not just business people, but also cultural ambassadors, carrying stories, traditions, and knowledge between East and West. They exchanged much more than just physical goods, they exchanged worldviews. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in the inns and caravanserais along the way. Traders from China, India, Persia, and Rome, swapping tales of their homelands, sharing insights into new inventions, philosophies, or even religious beliefs. Perhaps the most famous of these merchants was Marco Polo, who traveled the Silk Roads in the 13th century and brought back incredible stories of his adventures in China. His tales of the wealth and wonder of the Mongol Empire captivated the European imagination. But Marco Polo was just one of many. There were countless others who traveled these routes, some leaving behind no record of their names, but whose contributions to the exchange of goods and ideas were just as vital. You could almost imagine the long stretches of time spent on the road, the slow rhythms of travel weeks spent crossing vast deserts, the quiet hum of a camel caravan making its way through a starry night, the clink of metal pots, and the rustling of fabrics in the wind. Along the way, traders would stop at oasis towns to rest, drink, and share stories, building relationships that would help them when it came time to trade. These were the people who kept the Silk Roads alive, making sure the flow of goods and culture never stopped. Historians often ask whether the legacy of the Silk Roads would be the same without these merchants. Could such a vast network of trade have existed without the courage and determination of these individuals? While it's true that large empires like the Romans, the Persians, and the Mongols helped establish the infrastructure for the Silk Roads, it was the merchants who brought them to life, turning them from theoretical paths into real, vibrant arteries of commerce and culture. These unsung heroes are the ones who kept the Silk Roads buzzing, bringing goods to new markets and introducing ideas that helped shape civilizations. As we reflect on the lives of the traders who made the Silk Roads come to life, it's time to talk about a darker, more complex side of the story, the role of war in shaping these ancient trade routes. You might think that trade and warfare don't really mix, but in the case of the Silk Roads, the two were deeply intertwined. The movement of goods and ideas along these routes was often shaped by the ebb and flow of power. Empires and kingdoms rose and fell along the Silk Roads, and their wars, conquests, and diplomatic alliances often determined which goods could pass through and which would be blocked. The Mongol Empire, for example, played a pivotal role in revitalizing the Silk Roads during the 13th and 14th centuries. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created a vast empire that stretched across much of Asia, unifying large swaths of land and facilitating trade. Genghis Khan himself was a ruthless warrior, but he understood the importance of trade for sustaining his empire. Under his rule, the Mongols not only expanded the territory of the Silk Roads, but also ensured the safety of merchants by offering protection from bandits. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, was a period in which trade flourished as the Mongol Empire unified and secured vast regions, making it easier for goods to move along the routes. But of course, the Mongols weren't the only empire to influence the Silk Roads. The Romans, the Persians, and the Byzantine Empire all had their hands in the Silk Road game, whether they were controlling key trade routes or waging wars to secure access to vital goods. The Romans, for example, fought wars with the Parthians and the Sassanids over control of the Silk Road's western access, trying to secure access to the precious silk that flowed from China. In fact, the very existence of the Silk Roads was often a result of these power struggles with each empire trying to control the flow of goods that passed through their territory. Even outside of the large empires, smaller kingdoms and city-states along the Silk Roads were shaped by the need to control trade routes. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Antioch became key centers of commerce, but they were also prime targets for conquest. The constant back and forth between empires' kingdoms and smaller city-states often led to skirmishes or full-scale wars, as control of trade routes was essential for the prosperity of any nation. Historians still debate the extent to which warfare impacted the development of the Silk Roads. Did the constant conflict make these routes more dangerous and harder to travel? Or did it simply shape how the routes were used and who controlled them? Some argue that the protection provided by empires like the Mongols allowed trade to flourish, while others point out that the political instability created by war meant that only the most determined and sometimes the most ruthless traders could make their way across these dangerous lands. What we do know is that the Silk Roads were constantly shaped by the forces of war and diplomacy. The goods that moved along these routes were often products of not just trade, but conquest, and the flow of goods was influenced by the rise and fall of empires. In many ways, the trade that took place along the Silk Roads was not just about the exchange of silk, spices, and glass. It was also a reflection of the political, military, and diplomatic maneuvering that determined which goods and ideas could move freely, and which were blocked by borders and conflict. The impact of warfare on the Silk Roads can be seen in how different regions rose to prominence or fell into decline. The decline of the Roman Empire, for example, disrupted the flow of goods from the west to the east, and the rise of the Islamic caliphates and the Mongol Empire later changed the political landscape of the trade routes. But despite the wars and the conquests, the Silk Roads endured. Trade routes would shift, but the desire for goods, ideas, and power continued to drive the movement of people and commodities across Asia and Europe. As we near the end of our journey along the Silk Roads, let's take a step back and reflect on the lasting legacy these trade routes left on the world. The Silk Roads weren't just a series of paths through the desert. They were the lifeblood of ancient global exchange, influencing everything from cuisine to culture and even modern trade practices. The goods that traveled these routes, from silk to spices paper to precious stones, shaped civilizations for centuries, and their impact is still felt today. What's perhaps most fascinating is how these trade routes laid the foundation for our modern global economy. In many ways, the Silk Roads were the first truly global network long before the Internet or international shipping companies existed. The idea of exchanging goods across continents, connecting cultures, ideas, and technologies was revolutionary. The flow of silk from China, the spices from India, and the glass from Venice was more than just a trade of commodities. It was a movement of human experience. Every piece of silk, every ounce of pepper, every vial of perfume told a story of people who dared to traverse harsh landscapes of merchants, who built relationships that transcended borders, and of cultures that collided, adapted, and grew because of these interactions. One of the most profound impacts of the Silk Roads was the exchange of ideas. While goods were traded, so too were philosophies, religions, and innovations. Buddhism traveled from India to China along the trade routes profoundly shaping East Asia. Likewise, the exchange of Greek, Roman, and Persian philosophies with the East helped shape the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Even medical practices like the use of herbal remedies and acupuncture spread along these roads, becoming integral parts of both Eastern and Western healing traditions. The Silk Roads didn't just change the world in terms of commerce, they also helped form the cultural and intellectual foundations of the civilizations that participated in the trade. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara became thriving centers of culture and scholarship, where ideas from across the world converged. The very notion of globalization was born here in these ancient markets, where people from all walks of life came together to exchange not just goods, but also knowledge. Historians still debate the full extent of the legacy left by the Silk Roads. Some argue that the exchange of goods and ideas along these routes accelerated the development of the modern world, providing the foundation for the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Others suggest that the Silk Roads were just one part of a broader, more interconnected world. Either way, there's no denying that these trade routes transformed the course of history in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. And as we close out this journey, think about the world we live in today. We're living in an era where goods are traded globally in the blink of an eye, where cultures blend seamlessly through technology, and where the desire for exchange continues to drive our global economy. The Silk Roads were the first true example of a global network, and while they may have faded away with the rise of maritime trade routes and modern technology, their legacy lives on in the very nature of how we interact with each other across vast distances. As we wind down and the journey comes to a close, take a moment to reflect on the deep connections that the Silk Roads forged between civilizations. They didn't just trade goods, they built bridges. They made the world smaller, more interconnected, and in many ways they gave birth to the global world we live in today. And though you may never walk the dusty roads of Samarkand or see the caravanserais of ancient Persia, you're still part of that same global exchange carried forward by the very legacy these roads left behind. Now, as the Silk Roads fade into the horizon of history, let your mind wander along the paths they carved through the deserts, over the mountains, and into the bustling markets where goods, ideas, and cultures once met. Feel the gentle rhythm of the journey like the soft hum of a caravan traveling under the stars, and let the memories of these ancient trade routes carry you into a peaceful slumber,